Well, thank you all for the very warm welcome I've received. I had an opportunity to meet with your committee last night, and I'm meeting you as much as I can today. It's really quite an honour for me to be here with you because you have such an important history here in New Zealand, and your history is part of history in general. And I'm just catching up to and learning some of that history as we go, and I believe that we're all a part of something big that's actually happening. So today I actually want to talk about my perspective on some of the changes, some of the things that I'm seeing in that context. Let me give you a little bit of my background. I'm from Brisbane, Australia. I've grown up there all my life. I've been a Christian all my life. Pretty typical mainstream church, Baptist circles. And from an early age, I developed an interest in eschatology, funnily enough. And I'm not sure whether you probably might even know Barry Smith. Yes, lots of nods. He was an influence on me early on. And I read all of his books and similar books. And I came to kind of rethink that perspective at some point, and I thought, I need to move on to something else because that was disappointing. You know, I actually spent a lot of money, a lot of my time in that area. And I moved into apologetics and Christian worldview, and that's what I've done in ministry, in the local church, teaching young people in particular how to think through the challenges of our faith, how to have convictions that Christianity is true. And that remains an interest for me, but a few years ago a friend gave me Edward Fudge's writings, and I was very reluctant even to read them. You know, it's quite a substantial commitment. But I had a few books on my desk, and eventually I encountered the view Conditional Immortality, and I was shocked. And I was not only shocked at the strength of the biblical case for the view, but I was shocked at the fact that I was not even aware of this view. Something so commendable, something so strong. How had I grown up in the church and not even been aware? And so that was quite motivating. That motivated me to action, and it kind of reinvigorated my early interest in eschatology. And that continues strong today. I can see how important that is once again. And as I mentioned a few years ago, I think about 4 years ago now, and as Tanya mentioned as well, my motivation to action took this expression, rethinking hell. We started a Facebook group. I contacted a number of people, whoever I could find, who was like-minded and who wanted to have this conversation about this particular view. And we designed a logo, and we built a website, and all those sorts of things that are standard today for getting something started. And it quickly grew, and it didn't stop growing. And many people came out of the woodwork. And again, I was shocked. I was quite taken aback by the energy behind this particular thing that I had not even heard of in decades in the church. So in 2014 we had our first conference in Houston, strategically chosen to be close to Edward Fudge. And that conference was called The Legacy of Edward Fudge and the Future of Conditionalism. I know Jeff and Penny were over there at the time. And that was just a real celebration of Edward and a real investigation of the next stage of this movement. 2015 we had another conference at Fuller Seminary in California. And so that's the topic of that one was conditional immortality and the challenge of universal salvation. So part of our approach was to engage other views on hell, such as universalism, and this was an example of us doing that. We're not necessarily continuing in the same vein, but we wanted to have a conference where everybody got a hearing. And we're looking forward to our next conference later this year in London, which is exciting. In a few short years, with the help of our team, we've been able to publish 2 books on the subject: Rethinking Hell, Readings in Evangelical Conditionalism. So we gathered together the best summary writings of people like John Stott, very much in the evangelical camp, and this is essentially a reader, so for people to encounter the best writings that we could find. The second book came out of that first conference, and it's what you call a fetchrift. It's an academic celebration of someone's career. So this book was given to Edward in his honour. It's called A Consuming Passion, Essays on Hell and Immortality in Honour of Edward Fudge. And there he is receiving this book when it was presented to him. One of the things we've done is put together a diagram. Now, you won't be able to see all the detail on that, don't worry about that. Called affectionately Hell Triangle. And it's a way for people to focus in on the different views and the things that we need to think about. Down in the bottom left is the traditional view, called eternal torment for short. And the definition we've got there: everyone lives forever, the unsaved suffer everlasting conscious torment. And you'll notice 3 arrows coming out of that. They're just different versions, different flavours of the traditional view. At the bottom right of the triangle, our view, conditionalism, also known as annihilationism. And our simple definition here is: the saved are raised in immortal glory to live forever. The unsaved are raised in mortal shame to be finally destroyed. This may include temporary suffering. As you know, there are different views on that. Up the top, universalism. Everyone lives forever. The unsaved are refined and ultimately saved. Now, in the middle of the triangle, we have a little snake representing evil. And these 2 questions I've put on the side come out of this related topic. Is justice concerning the unsaved finally corporal, capital, or remedial? So we want people to think about justice. What is God's justice like? And over on the right-hand side, is evil in the cosmos or the universe? What happens to it? Is it finally converted? Is it restrained in some location? Or is it too annihilated or destroyed? And we have some key talking points that we'd like people to think about deeply. Life, death, creation, redemption, justice and evil, and of course Scripture as the authority for our understanding. And although we're promoting conversation, we are quite strong advocates of conditionalism as well. So we have those 2 things that we do. We make that very clear. Here is a good definition of conditional immortality that we use. It's the view that life or existence is the Creator's provisional gift to all people, which will ultimately either be granted forever or revoked forever. So it starts in a general way, it talks about life, and then it's talking about immortality being only available to some. And that's the study of eschatology, or future things. That's where we'd like to focus. So what I'd like to do to begin with is start with this very important chapter of 1 Corinthians 15. It's something of a platform for discussion. I think it's profound, a lot of good content in there. And so just briefly for context, it starts off and it says, Paul says, this is a reminder of the good news to those who are being saved. This is a very important context to know that he's talking about things that believers are interested in. And he goes on to talk about matters of first importance. Christ died for our sins, according to the scriptures. He was buried. He rose again on the third day, according to the scriptures. And then he goes on to list all the eyewitnesses, from Peter right down to Paul himself. And then from verse 35 to the end, it's all about the nature of the believer's resurrection. So I want to emphasize that. It's talking about the believer's hope. We will need to look elsewhere in the Bible to learn that there is another kind of resurrection for the unjust. It's one to shame and condemnation. John chapter 5, Daniel 12:2, and Acts 24:15. And I think it's very important to recognize that that's hardly mentioned at all in Scripture. So quite often when the resurrection is being discussed, it's as if that wasn't even taking place, even though we know that it does, but there's a real focus on the believer's resurrection. So at one point in this chapter, Paul says, "You foolish person." He wants to, let me read it for you. Someone will ask, "How are the dead raised? With what kind of body do they come?" "You foolish person, what you sow does not come to life unless it dies. And what you sow is not the body that is to be, but a bare kernel, perhaps of wheat or some other grain. But God gives it a body as he has chosen, to each kind of seed its own body." So when he says "you foolish person," he expects them to already know this doctrine. "For not all flesh is the same, but there is one kind for humans, another kind for animals, another for birds and fish. There are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but the glory of the heavenly is of one kind, the glory of the earthly is another. There is one glory of the sun, one for the moon, another for the stars, and different glory for different stars." Now, does that strike you, as it strikes me, a little bit unfamiliar, a little bit odd? A way of thinking about creation that we don't normally talk about. We don't assign different glories to different bodies, right? So I think there's something to be learned here. I think there's, he's plugging into a background that we don't necessarily have. Goes on, "So it is with the resurrection of the dead. What is sown is perishable, what is raised is imperishable. Sown in dishonor, raised in glory." Now, there's the word honor there. Dishonor, honor. We don't use these terms in our culture much anymore either. We're not a culture of honor and shame. So glory and honor are concepts that were obvious to Paul and the Corinthian church, but not so much to us. Romans 2:7 says, "To those who by patience in well-doing seek for glory and honor," there's those two terms again, "and immortality," our term, "he will give eternal life." Again, I think that's a little bit unusual. What does that mean? How do you seek for glory and honor? I think we have certain ideas of what it might mean. Maybe they're a little bit vague, but I've studied, I've done word studies on this, and I think Paul is using these terms very specifically as technical terms that, if we understand, will shed much light on the Bible. But first, I'd like to remind us all of some of the things we really do believe that are strange to modern ears. Frankly, there are some very strange and unusual things going on in the Bible. For example, apparently you can build a tower that goes all the way up to heaven, and that somehow upgrades you. There's something going on there with the height that we don't understand. There was an incredible destruction by water of the earth. This is a world where fire can come down from heaven and destroy a city. Strange visions. That's Ezekiel's vision in Ezekiel chapter 1. He said, "Such was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord." Well, that's something you don't see every day in our modern world, right? descending. We call it a ladder, but it was something more like a ramp or a staircase. We'll come back to this episode later, but it's very strange. The burning bush is another. Pillar of fire. Mountain of fire. That's Mount Sinai. Strange phenomenon. The wilderness tabernacle and the Shekinah glory that descended on that place. The Ark of the Covenant, a place where God's presence manifests. Elijah at Mount Carmel, fire from heaven. Transfiguration, another very unusual event that we believe happened, and yet it's so unfamiliar. Fire descending on top of people's heads at Pentecost. Strange things going on. This is a diagram of a Hebrew conception of the cosmos. And you'll notice right away that it's not really how we think of the universe. We've been up in space. We have a very different conception of things. But the more you study the Bible and biblical perspective, the more you hear about things like pillars holding up the earth, the foundations of the earth. I mean, it's poetic language, but I think many of the ancients really did believe that rather literally. Sheol, the place of the dead, is just down below under our feet. Heaven is up there above the clouds, and so on. Now, at this time in history, many of you have lived through what's being called the decline of Christendom. Christianity, at least in the West, enjoyed a very privileged position in culture. Many of the things that people believed in general in culture were very similar to what Christians believed. There was a real closeness to that. So the assumptions, the categories, even if you weren't a believer, you still thought in a similar way. But late last century, that began to shift, and it's still shifting away. We're really now in more of a post-Christian era. And in this context, the worldview of the Bible seems, if we're being honest, archaic. Some people think, they were scientifically illiterate and so on. One resource that will help us to see why that's not the case is to think about the difference between cosmology, which is what we know when we use our telescopes, and cosmography, which is more of a map of what the world is like. Now, a map doesn't have to be exact. It doesn't have to be scientific. There are all different kinds of maps. Maybe you've heard the phrase, the map is not the territory. There's a distinction to be made there. And what we're finding, perhaps even in response to some of these challenges in the decline of a Christianized world, is a theological response, a theological turn toward something called biblical cosmology, which is a little bit like that diagram of the Hebrew cosmos, and biblical theology. So we've had a lot of systematic theology, but there is a real discernible shift now. And I think this is encouraging news for our view, because I think this is the precursor to everybody realizing what the Bible really does say. First, you need a better understanding of the universe. And to be more specific, kind of an overarching framework for the plot line of the Bible has been this one. I'm sure you're familiar with that: creation, fall, redemption. It just makes it really simple. But this shift that I'm talking about, similar thing, but it might be better stated: creation, fall, new creation. Now, obviously, the key difference is there at the end, but there are a lot of particulars along the way which all add up to kind of like a paradigm shift, an overall significant difference. So let's look at that a bit more closely. On the traditional view, if you like, when you talk about salvation or redemption, you're really talking about individuals. And we had the Enlightenment, and that was very individualistic. So it appeals to our self-interest. You know, we really want to know what's going to happen to us. And so you would hear this concise gospel pitch. If you were going to die tonight, where would you spend eternity? I'm sure you've heard versions of that. You might have said that to people. And I guess there's nothing really wrong with that. But maybe when you start to unpack, the answer was implicit. You're either going to heaven or you're going to hell. And those are seen as two different places. We don't exactly know where they are, but they're a long way from here, right? There's a destination you've got to get to. Heaven, of course, is this sort of vague idea of clouds and angels and harps. And we have an equally vague idea of hell in this tradition. But where's earth? Well, earth, on this view, earth is no longer needed. So it's utterly destroyed. Now, when we hear this, we're thinking the planet Earth, right? Because we have a modern vision of a globe, and so we have this imagination of, well, that's destroyed. If we don't, God doesn't need it anymore because we're going to get out of here. We're going somewhere else. There's just one problem with that. The Bible talks about a new heavens and a new earth. So it's a little bit awkward on this model, but we need to fit that somewhere. So what happens is, and I still remember my confusion on this even a few years ago, I was thinking, I think I understand the new earth, but why would God destroy heaven? Why would there be a new heaven? What's wrong with heaven? That's where God is. But that's what happens on this view. God destroys his own abode, and it gets replaced by another heaven, just as earth gets replaced. And since we're all going to heaven, we imagine that somewhere on the other side of the universe, we have to put the new earth over there in the same place, so it sort of gets tacked on to the end of the celestial shore with a bit of earth thrown in. And as I mentioned, it's all a little bit vague and confusing. And you might have heard someone say, everyone lives forever. The only question is where you will spend eternity. So on this view, what gets emphasized is living forever, universal immortality, everyone lives forever, and there are these two different destinations. What gets de-emphasized, the earth, as I mentioned, and the resurrection hope. This wicked world is not my home, I'm just passing through. I'm going to heaven when I die. And sometimes final judgment is even de-emphasized as well, because sinners go to hell maybe when they die, maybe before the end. Due to some of these problems, theologians are now shifting to this alternative understanding. On this view, the new creation equals the new heavens and new earth. So that very much accounts for what the Bible's talking about there. It's front and center. And that's the final state of the cosmos, new heavens and new earth. Instead of being separated like heaven and hell, they are seen as an integrated whole. And not only that, but it's possible to think of the present heavens and earth being renewed rather than destroyed and replaced by brand new versions. So on this view, instead of earth being an afterthought, there's much more continuity with the present. And we begin to think more in terms of a shift of the ages. There's the present age, there's the age to come, not two different places. And we don't feel like we need to escape the earth, which is our home. Moreover, the resurrection is seen as a coming back to life, rather than some sort of prelude to going away somewhere else. So the new creation equals the new heavens and earth, and it equals this idea of cosmic renewal. God's going to make everything new without destroying everything. A famous theologian in the area of eschatology said Christian eschatology must be broadened out into cosmic eschatology, for otherwise it becomes a Gnostic doctrine of redemption, and is bound to teach no longer the redemption of the world, but a redemption from the world, no longer the redemption of the body, but a deliverance of the soul from the body. So I won't spend too much more time on this particular aspect of the shift, but a number of key books that I might mention. Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright, that was very helpful to me. It's a summary of his more academic work. More recently, a book called A New Heaven and a New Earth by Middleton. It's called subtitled Reclaiming Biblical Eschatology. And the Gospel Coalition reviewed this and said that this view could revolutionize global Christianity. Similar books, Salvation Means Creation Healed, subtitle Overcoming the Divorce of Heaven and Earth, and another one by Beale, God Dwells Among Us, Expanding Eden to the Ends of the Earth. There's a few more there as well. What I'd like to do now is change tack a little bit and flesh out some of the particulars of this overall shift in theology. And I'd like to do that with about 5 major Bible themes and a couple of sub-themes. So if you would, I'll just leave each slide up with the actual theme. So if you would just listen carefully and draw on your understanding of the Bible as we go, as well as I talk. No doubt you've got a whole bunch of scriptures and passages that might come to mind that are relevant, and of course there's way too much material there for us to cover. So this will be just a sketch of this shift. Now, glory, as I mentioned already, it's a specific thing in the Bible. It's more of a technical term. When we use it, it's kind of something to do with praise. Glory. We give glory to God. We honor God. In the Bible, there's quite a spectrum for this concept. It's really, really fascinating. The start, in the very first occasion of the use of this concept, is when Jacob was working for Uncle Laban, and he'd done his duty, and he was about to leave, and he started breeding goats, right? And he was doing very well, and his animal husbandry skills were impressive, to say the least, and he was gaining more and more through breeding. And if you look closely at the text, something about that was God's help, and something about that was just him being competent and knowing the right things to do. But that's the first word of glory there. When he left Laban, he took with him a lot of glory, and it's referring to his possessions, the flocks and servants. So he was building his own household, and that's the first concept. Compare that, it gets developed in the story of Joseph. And Joseph found his way into the upper echelons of Egypt, didn't he? And he became second in charge, manager over first Potiphar's house, then Pharaoh. And just such a competent manager. And so along with that was managing all the administrations of the kingdom, food, wealth, flocks, you name it. So this is the beginnings of a trajectory of a developing concept of glory. And so individual people had more glory than others by virtue of their status, if you like, their ability to be wise managers and faithful stewards over a particular estate. But as the concept developed, we hear more about... Now, if you do a word study, by the way, it's some sort of essential weightiness of being. Somewhere inside, you've got this glory that you're able to express. And so at the other end of the spectrum, quite literally, you can see this glory shining forth. An obvious example is the glory of God. It's a bright, shining light. So this is when glory manifests. And the Transfiguration was an example of people seeing Jesus' true glory, if you like, maybe his true form. And the rest of the time it was sort of kept a little bit hidden on the inside. So glory is this really flexible concept which can be hidden. It's the individual has the glory, but it can be expressed either in management or quite literally in a shining, luminous, angelic glory that the shepherds saw in the night sky. Now what will happen is we'll come back after I've covered these themes and they'll hopefully start to come together so that you can see what's really going on. Heaven, there's been a bit of a rethinking of heaven. I've already really covered much of that. But the gist of it is that rather than thinking of heaven as a place up there, although that's a valid and helpful picture of heaven, it's also this idea of a rule, God's rule, God's space. So wherever God is, heaven is his kingdom, his rule, his domain. It's not necessarily always up there. In fact, the first time the word for heaven appears in the Bible is Genesis 1:1, and it's a plural, the heavens. And it really means the skies. So there are many poetic places in the Bible, such as the Psalms, that use the location of the skies to paint a picture of God's presence being there, but it's trying to convey the idea of transcendence, exaltation, authority above the earth. But it's worth noting that the biblical authors just did not think that God always stayed in heaven. God's space or God's presence was liable to show up in different places on the earth, wasn't it? In fact, the Bible opens with God's presence being on the earth with human beings in the Garden of Eden. There's no time to flesh out all the details, but one of the changing mindsets among Bible scholars is that Eden itself could be considered like heaven, or like a temple, a sacred space. And so there's a strain of theology called temple theology, which is relevant here. Eden being the first sanctuary within the earth. But God's space was overlapping with human space in the Garden of Eden. One of the clear indicators of that, once you start investigating it, is to understand the cherubim at the gate. We have pictures of what that might look like in our mind, but I think I've got a picture here. This is probably closer to the truth. These are Syrian Lamassu statues. You might think of the Sphinx, something similar. You have more of an animal body, a human face, and wings. And these are called cherubim in their languages. And the biblical descriptions of cherubim are much more along these lines. But what they are, at least in other ancient Near East cultures, they are throne guardians. They are guardians of sacred space, guardians of the temple. So you'd station two of these guys at the entrance to a sacred space, maybe the king's throne, maybe the temple of a god. So Adam and Eve would have instantly understood these guardians of the sacred space of Eden. They have been barred from God's presence. And it's this understanding that Eden is special. Now, I grew up thinking that Eden was the whole earth, but of course that's not what the Bible says, right? There's a gate, and the rest of the earth is beyond Eden. So there is structure in God's universe, in this cosmos, in the biblical cosmos. There's heavens and earth. There's this idea of sacred space or a temple. And again, that's not as familiar to us. But this is really being recovered. So just generally speaking, temples are a place where God's space and human space overlap. It's a place where if you're fit to see God, to be in God's presence, such as a priest, you can quite literally encounter God in the same space. That's also very common. That's just what temples were in the ancient cultures. But the difference with Israel was that God was not a tribal God. He's not a regional God. He's God over all things. He's the creator. So everything is God's space. You might even say that the entire creation is God's temple. This is called the cosmic temple. So, as I mentioned, in Jacob's dream, what we call a ladder was really more like a ramp. And it's actually, the word tells us, it was one of these ramps or staircases that leads up to a temple, like an ancient ziggurat of Babylon. And these really long staircases that you go up, you ascend, to go into the temple. And so we're meant to pick up on this if we understand the context. When he woke up, he said, what did he say? He said, God was in this place and I didn't even realize it. So he called it Bethel, which means house of God. He made an offering, and later on a shrine temple was set up at this location. The prophets speak about that. And so it was a special place. It's the overlap of heaven and earth coming together. And Jacob just lived in that kind of a world where that was unusual, but it didn't rock his world. I mean, he understood the idea already. And so I think we need to inhabit that same world, and it's encouraging to see that these changes are taking place. As this theology develops, as I'll explain, it really converges on conditional immortality. So this is one way in which I think this will succeed and is succeeding, is in the area of explaining all of these changes that are taking place. Something very, very fascinating. When Jesus came along, you remember he saw Nathanael under the fig tree, and that was very impressive to Nathanael. And what did he say? He said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." He said, "You will see heaven opened and angels descending on the Son of Man," referring to himself. Now this is actually alluding to Jacob's ladder. So he's actually explaining that within himself, all authority has been given to him in heaven and earth, and he is the sacred place. He is the temple because of this illusion. This is a special place on earth. So we see many other similar examples of this worldview, if you like, in the Bible. One that I'll mention, similar to Jacob's vision, was Isaiah's vision of the temple. He saw God's lower half, the train of his robe filled the temple, so the lower parts of the throne. But where was the top part? We didn't see it, but it was somewhere up in heaven. So it's this same idea of an overlap. Simultaneously God can be present on earth and in heaven. When King Solomon dedicated the temple, which of course was a special place, very overtly for God to be, he said, "Even the highest heavens cannot contain thee. How much less this house?" So there's this growing realization that God is everywhere. God is up in heaven. God's transcendent. He's immanent. You can meet with him in special places. And yet there's something developing here. You can't put God in a box. There's something unfinished about this picture of a temple. And so when Jesus comes on the scene, there's a clear shift. He's clearly doing something. And when he spoke about, later on, he prophesied, the temple will be destroyed and I will raise it up again in 3 days. And it says in the Bible he spoke about his body. They didn't understand it. And there's a theological turn here between the outward temple and Jesus' body as temples. And of course, if you can recall some of the ways that that's talked about in the New Testament, that has something to do with our bodies as well, doesn't it? So our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit. And so we follow in Christ's footsteps. And the Bible talks about not only as individuals are we God's temple, but also corporately as the church. We're being built into a spiritual house. All right, the next theme, kingdom. If the question was, what did Jesus spend the most time speaking about? This is the answer. John the Baptist came first and he says, the kingdom of God is almost here, repent. And so it's a little bit of bad news mixed in with that message, because you need to repent, and otherwise there's consequences. And then he said, behold the Lamb of God. And when Jesus came, his message was very similar. The kingdom of God is now here, repent and believe. Believe in me. So he is the king. We know that he's the king of the kingdom. But this was his main message, and he taught at great length about what the kingdom of God is like. Over 50 times in Matthew alone, where it's called the kingdom of heaven. But it's really like the kingdom from heaven, isn't it? And this word kingdom in both Hebrew and Greek connotes this idea of a rule. Not so much a place, but a reign. The Lord's Prayer, very familiar to all of us. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. So there's a direction to that. We would like the kingdom to come from heaven to earth, and it's also coming in time. It's starting. Now, if you recall the opening scene of the book of Acts, Jesus has been appearing to his disciples for a period of 40 days, telling them about the kingdom of God, it says. That's the main thing he was still talking about. Now, in Acts chapter 1:6, the disciples had a question for Jesus. Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Let's see if I have a slide for that. No, I don't think so. Now, I used to think that, what a silly question, they still don't get it. After all these years, even Jesus was just teaching them for 40 days about the kingdom, all these details, and they asked this silly question. It sounds like a political thing, right? National Israel is a controversial topic in the church. And they asked this question, is it time now to restore the kingdom to Israel? But did he say, you foolish people, I've been with you so long, you still don't get it? No, he said, you just don't get to know the times and the seasons that the Father has set. So he didn't actually correct them. Now, I would be careful not to read certain things into that, but what I think we can say for sure is that that's valid. However they understood it, that's valid. So it's certainly not this idea of going away to heaven, right? This kingdom somewhere else. Something's arriving and something's going to manifest. And of course, we can trace these back to the promises to Abraham. And that's actually what Peter says in chapter 3 of Acts. He talks about the promises first to Israel, then to Samaria, Judea, and then the ends of the earth. So all the nations of the earth will be blessed through this kingdom. Now, what this tells you, though, is that there was an understanding in the Old Testament, and so we've got to go back and find out, what did the kingdom mean before Jesus came on the scene? How do we understand that? And in fact, it's always been in play. It was there right at the beginning. When God, it's this concept of ruling, right? Having stewardship or ruling authority in the earth. And that was given to human beings, to Adam and Eve. The first time that idea appears, they were to rule over the fish of the sea. So it's closely connected to the idea of the image of God. Being human has a vocation attached to it, a commission, where we are to rule on behalf of the one true King. So we are co-regents. We're kind of second in charge, rather like Jacob or Joseph. And so that brings us to the last major theme that I think is relevant to our topic, the image of God. Remember those statues from before, the Lamassu, the cherubim? That's also a good reference point to understand other cultures in the ancient world as to how they thought of this concept of the image of God. That was what they called them, the image of God. And of course, when you think about what is an image, a graven image, statue, some sort of an image or representation of God. But there is attached to that the idea of rule. Okay, so the key difference is that images of God, human beings, are alive. God breathed life into us. And so we are active. We're not like idols, useless idols who just stand there and do nothing. The image of God in the Bible is about actively stewarding God's creation. This, in addition to the shift on heaven, the shift in this area I think is very strong and very important for conditionalist theology. So let's move on. So there are some scriptures there you'd be familiar with this passage. Right when we hear about the image of God, we also hear about what God wants us to do about it. Have dominion. And it just talks about ruling over the earth, subduing it. Be useful. Be productive, develop what the potentials that God has put into the earth. Look after the animals, agriculture, dig things up out of the ground, make things. Look after each other, build societies, fill the earth. Psalm chapter 8, I believe, is absolutely pivotal for our theology, because the New Testament picks up, in many places, picks up on this chapter. And Psalm 8 is a reflection on the image of God in Genesis. And it's got some real theological meat. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, maybe this is what Paul had in mind in 1 Corinthians 15. He's talking about all the glory in creation. When I look at all this glory in creation, what are human beings that you care about us? You have made him a little lower than the heavenly beings and crowned him with glory and honor. Those two terms from Romans. You've given him dominion, put all things under his feet. That phrase, all things under his feet, is in 1 Corinthians 15, talking about Jesus. It's another place he's talking about Jesus. When Jesus came on the scene, he was representing the true image of God. He's called the image of God in the New Testament. And he was faithfully living up to this high calling that Psalm 8 is talking about. Jesus lived with glory and honor. He loved his neighbors, cared about others. He stewarded others. He had dominion. And now he's been exalted, and now all things in heaven and earth have been put under his feet. But in this role, he's an exalted human. This is the human side of Jesus. So in Hebrews 2, it says Jesus was crowned with glory and honor. We were supposed to exhibit glory and honor, but something went wrong. And so Jesus needs to be truly human. He needs to be the perfect image of God as our representative. And so he was crowned with glory and honor. And Hebrews 2 says he brings many sons to glory. And it also says all things were put in subjection under him. So those are the 5 themes. And this is a helpful quote just to sum up. It's in God's purposes from creation that the unbreakable linkage between resurrection and the restoration of rule is forged. From the beginning, God's intent for human life was centered on the royal status of humanity and our commission to image our Creator. God's intent was for the flourishing of human beings in the earth. Now, since resurrection is God's restoration of human life to what it was meant to be, it naturally requires the fulfillment of the original human status. Resurrection, therefore, when biblically understood, can't be separated from this whole idea of living as humans in the earth. And he goes on actually to say that he thinks this is compatible with annihilation. And one of his terms is cosmic disinheritance. So there is a logic that is emerging out of this picture. So I talked before about this old view of heaven and earth being two realities, but now we've got one integrated reality that is coming about. It's the kingdom of God. It's the new heavens and new earth. That's the final vision of the Bible. And the logic to emerge out of that is that people are being prepared for that. And so when that happens, when Jesus comes back, there's nowhere else for others to go. Okay? That's the finished universe. And so Middleton has this phrase, cosmic disinheritance. So whereas believers are looking forward to our inheritance, the promises to Abraham in the earth, those who miss out, who don't belong there, will not receive that same inheritance. So it logically follows, even before you look at all the texts about final destruction, that there's nowhere else that God's planned for them to be. There's no point to anywhere else. This is the whole point to what God's doing. Changing tack again, I have this kind of crash course that I like to give people of a number of key texts in the New Testament. Many will be familiar, but this is a nice way of drawing things together. And then I'd like to just say one more thing, and then we'll have a time of discussion. But listen carefully for terms like glory and honour. All those ideas that we've encountered, manifest presence, being prepared for that final moment where we encounter God in a new heavens and new earth. If you recall, the very end of the book of Revelation is that final scene. The dwelling place of God is with man. The glory of the Lord fills the whole earth as the waters cover the sea. It's just a wonderful, wonderful end vision. So here is the tour. God alone has immortality. Glory and honour are things that are forever due to this immortal God. You'll notice the scripture references there. But the glory of the immortal God, by the way, I'm following the biblical language almost verbatim. I've only just sort of rounded it out so it flows. Very intentionally from the ESV Bible in this tour, all the key phrases and terms are straight out of the text. I've changed it as little as possible. The glory of the immortal God has been exchanged for false images of mortal creatures. Now we're in gospel territory here, right? This is early on in Romans. This is Paul's explanation of what's gone wrong. This is big picture stuff. The glory of God is where sinners fall short. You're familiar with that verse. And yet, those who seek for glory and honour and immortality will be given eternal life. Not everybody is going to have those things. It's clear from this text. They will put on immortality because Jesus abolished death and brought life and immortality to light through the gospel. He was raised and will never die again. Death no longer has dominion over him. Consequently, for those who will put on immortality, death will be swallowed up in victory. This is back to our reference chapter. tail end of 1 Corinthians 15, it begins to integrate some of these key terms. As in your own time you study this chapter, just notice things we've talked about, particularly the concept of glory and honour, bearing the image. Adam was a man of the earth, so think about the temple, think about the cosmos. Jesus is from heaven, and we need to be remade into his image. But all this plugs back into the original image of God and what it means to live as a human. So new creation, it turns out, has an application to each one of us. Paul said, you are a new creation. So within the whole new creation, something special is going on within his people, his church. And as you know, this sort of climaxes in this idea of a certain kind of resurrection, a victorious resurrection, glorious, imperishable, incorruptible, immortal. I know you'd be well familiar with that chapter. So, picking up on the tour again, they have put on the new self, created after the image of God. Their old self was corrupted and alienated from the life of God. So there's this interesting phrase, there's something called the life of God. This, I think, helps to explain it. For as the Father has life in himself, so he has granted the Son also to have life in himself. Jesus said that. And the Son gives life to whom he will, just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life. He gives them a crown of life, in fact, a crown of unfading glory. So when you really study this concept of glory in all its richness, you find out that there's a temporal aspect to it. It can mean duration. It can mean if you have a little bit of glory, you'll last for a while, like the flowers of the field, and then you'll fade away. If you have the glory of the heavens, that's God's glory, that's immortal glory, that's unfading. And this is language in the New Testament, unfading glory. In bringing many sons to glory, Jesus was himself crowned with glory and honor. From one degree of glory to another, believers are being transformed into the image of the glory of the Lord. This means we are being conformed to the image of the Son, Romans 8:29. As per the gospel of the glory of Christ. These are phrases straight out of the Bible. The gospel is called the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God. So in bearing the image of the man from heaven, their body will be raised in glory. In other words, he will transform their lowly body to be like his glorious body. So there's something literal here. There's something connected to the body. When Christ, who is their life, appears, then they also will appear, maybe that means be manifest, with him in glory. This spectacular event occurs when he comes on that day to be glorified in his saints, that's not everybody, and to be marveled at among all who believed, that's not everybody. But he's being marveled at. His glory is finally revealed. They shall be presented blameless before the presence of his glory, just as he shall present the church to himself in splendor. They shall be like him when he appears. That's easy to miss that part. They shall be like him when he appears, because they will see him as he truly is. So all of these sort of related verses, you have to go hunting for them. But I think that they begin to paint a picture of the quality and the nature of the believer's resurrection that is often overlooked. We know about the fact of the resurrection, but its particular purpose, some other things that are going on with this amazing event are truly spectacular, and it's just hard to get your mind around what it will look like, what the experience will be like. But it all points back to a change that is experienced in us a transformation of our bodies, if you like, kind of a consummation of the body we now have. Now, in a longer version of this presentation, which some of this may come out in the discussion time, but I want to leave a little bit of time for that. There are a bunch of verses that are more to do with the negative fate, the annihilation, and how this plays out. But just so you have a sense of those passages, I'll give you a really quick snapshot of that. And this verse was, in my journey, this rocked me. I just couldn't get my mind around it until I applied conditionalism. Isaiah 33:14. The sinners in Zion are afraid. So remember, Zion is kind of this Jerusalem at the end, right? It's the holy city, this vision of the future. And they're afraid. Who among us can dwell with the consuming fire? We can't do it. We can't live there with God. Who among us can dwell with the everlasting burnings? So this is God's manifest glory, okay? But for some it's dangerous, and it's literally some kind of fire that consumes. You can think of the many occasions, Sodom and Gomorrah, Aaron's sons. But this is the flip side of the positive encounter with God's glorious presence, right? The dangerous side of his holiness. So that's one. A very famous and familiar passage, Isaiah 66, right at the end. Jesus called this scene at the end Gehenna. But at the beginning, it's this cosmic temple language. Heaven is my throne, earth is my footstool. What is the house that you have built for me, and what is the place of my rest? Obviously, God cannot be contained. That's the context. In the middle of that chapter, God comes back to the earth. And there's destruction, manifestation in fire. Talks about nations coming to see his glory. We just read about that in connection with Jesus. And it's with that context, the whole book of Isaiah finishes on this glorious and tragic scene of God's enemies consumed by fire and a new heavens and new earth. Right? So it's the end scene. When Paul talks about Jesus coming back, it's in a similar terms of this theophany, of this appearance of God. Jesus is coming in flaming fire. The more we are tuned into the Hebrew worldview of the Old Testament, the more we can refine our doctrine of final things, because we can see these things in the New Testament. It's a manifestation of glory, but it's dangerous. It consumes. And of course, that applies to those who aren't saved. Oh, and the key term there, the punishment of eternal destruction from the presence of the Lord and the glory of his might, straight out of Isaiah 2, that phrase, verbatim, almost. And it's exactly this scene of God's presence in the earth manifesting and people trying to hide from God. It's right here in the New Testament. And I read that verse before, when he's coming to be marveled at by believers. And it goes on to actually talk about the annihilation of the man of sin. Through the blast of a breath from his mouth. That's straight out of the Old Testament language of God coming to destroy his enemies. But bringing to nothing by the appearance of his coming. Okay? So as you do your studies, you'll begin to see this whole other side to it. And I would like to just finish on, let's say, this key chapter, Hebrews 12. The other one that's very key is 2 Peter 2 and 3, which is the great day of the Lord. It talks about this cosmic fire that's burning. It talks about the new heavens and new earth. Very, very critical chapter. And it talks about the day of the Lord, the day of the destruction of the ungodly. Really serious, dramatic stuff. But it's Judgment Day, and people are being annihilated by God's fire of judgment. Others are surviving that fire and living on until the new era of righteousness, it says. So let's finish with this, because I wouldn't want to miss this other critically important chapter, which I think ties it all together. It's in the second half of Hebrews 12. It invokes a lot of this Old Testament imagery, particularly Mount Sinai. You have not come to that scene, right? As believers, you have not come to that scene. You can't touch this blazing fire and darkness that surrounded this Mount Sinai. It was very scary. You'd die, even animals would die. But you have come to Mount Zion and to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, which remember is coming down, and to the angels, the assembly of the firstborn who are enrolled in heaven. Our citizenship is enrolled in heaven. And to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than that of Abel. Now, this is what I find most interesting. See that you do not refuse him who is speaking. For if they did not escape when they refused him who warned them on the earth, much less will we escape if we reject him who warns from heaven. At that time his voice shook the earth, but now he has promised, yet once more I will shake not only the earth, but also the heavens. This phrase, yet once more, indicates the removal of things that are shaken. So there's this big cosmic event. Everything, the heavens and the earth, everything's getting sifted and shaken up. Some things will be removed, things that can be shaken, things that have been made, temples made with human hands, things that are not of the heavenly order, so that the things that cannot be shaken may remain. Here's a real clear piece of logic. Some things are passing away, some things will remain. Therefore, let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken, and let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Now, I hope that even though there's much more that can be said, it's a big topic to cover. There's really the whole Bible that needs to be explored by Christians, but it's an encouragement, really, this message to you that we are now seeing not a radical shift, not a sort of throwing everything away. You know, all of the core important truths are still there, but some of these very key features of a biblical theology are clearly shifting, and all of the logic to emerge from that clarifies and unifies some of these very crucial texts in the New Testament, so that I see and others are seeing this play out at the moment in history. And it's exciting to see. I mean, there's new books coming out, new papers coming out all the time that are really just sort of driving this change. And there's so much more. It's really invigorated my faith too, and my interest in the Bible has only been heightened through conditionalism, because I'm discovering all these things. And it's making even more sense than it did. You know, we gloss over different parts of the Bible, right? If we don't, we just move on to the next thing. There's so much material. And I think that's what's been happening. We've all read these things before, but they haven't quite come together and jumped out at us. So that's exciting. And that's one of the ways I think that conditionalism is already succeeding. And I expect to see that play out. There are many other ways too. But I'm wondering whether you have any. So that's the theme of this talk. Okay, now it succeeds in terms of theology, explaining the Bible. We could perhaps talk about other things that are happening at this time in history. But what do you think? Did that raise any questions for you? Any insights you'd like to share, or even just something that might be to do with the general idea of how conditional immortality succeeds? So let's hear from you.
Thank you for a very comprehensive survey. What I found particularly interesting was you bring in the theme of glory. Now, in Salvation Army culture, promoted to glory went and up. And you've been majoring, of course, on the condition anthem, 1 Corinthians 15, which we love when we go to the Messiah, hearing that. And I was interested to see your selection of verses. There was questions of when and how. What about the thief on the cross and this idea of paradise? And how does that come into your scheme of glory? What about 1 Thessalonians 4, which is a kind of parallel to 1 Corinthians 15?
Sure.
No doubt we could go on for hours about that, but I'd be interested, since you've introduced this comprehensive, introducing glory, concept of glory, whether you wish to say anything more.
And you're quite right that a lot of people, traditionally we say, I'm going to glory. It's a place you go away to. And it's as I mentioned, it's sort of vague, but we sort of know what we mean, don't we? We're going somewhere, and it's going to be wonderful. The concept of paradise, I think that is part of this new understanding, and people are rethinking that as well. And it's not easy to pinpoint, because the Bible does seem to suggest, that's one example, the thief on the cross, and there are different views of that. But that's sort of one of the ones that might seem, and Paul's vision of being caught up, might seem to suggest that paradise is just this place up there in heaven. But if you look at some other references to the term, it's a reference, it means the garden of God. It evokes that imagery of Eden. So in the book of Revelation, paradise is mentioned, right, in that context. But that's back down on earth. Right, so if it starts on earth and it finishes on earth, there's some tension with this other idea that it's gone up to heaven and it's somewhere we could go to, maybe while we're waiting to come back here. And I think that there's really, really intriguing reference in Ezekiel to Eden being on top of a mountain. You were in paradise. So there is actually a tradition outside the Bible, the Jewish tradition, I believe, of Eden itself being exalted to heaven, or somehow. I mean, this is just imagery. We don't, even Eden is on the earth clearly in Genesis, but perhaps that idea there is in the Bible that's poetically, or it's been caught up because earth doesn't deserve it. Right? It's gone. We don't know where it is. But this is back to the idea that maybe it's a bit of a false dichotomy between heaven and earth. Maybe we've been thinking about those as two separate places when in fact the Bible doesn't think that way.
Yes.
They're really integrated realities. So today we have this concept of dimensions, the scientific idea of other dimensions. And so maybe that's a better way to think about God's space and paradise, where God is, it's always going to be paradise, right? But yes, I think I would point to the start and finish concepts in the Bible of paradise, and we should not step out. Anything else you might want to say about where it is, or if it's where it went, we have to remember that it refers to the garden of God, and it refers to Eden, the beginning of the world. And personally, there are controversies in that area, and in our context at Rethinking Hell, we're agnostic. We think that things that can't be known for sure, we can't be dogmatic. So we tend to focus more on the eschatology, on what happens in the end. But I'm aware, and many of those who are part of Rethinking Hell have their views quite strongly on that, and are free to champion what I understand is your view.
What do you think would be the most attractive part of the teaching of, say, life only in Christ for the traditional Christian who's not a scholar but just an ordinary Christian? What would be the most attractive part, do you think, to that they would look forward to by changing their point of view from traditionalist.
Yeah. Why would it
Yeah, why would one want to change?
Yeah. Well, I could say all the obvious things like, that's whatever is true is worth believing for its own sake, etc. But I hear a more interesting question and more interesting reasons to be motivated even to consider the view. And I think this is actually true whether or not you're a believer, because conditional immortality coupled to the vision I've just presented really speaks to very human longings and hopes. Not only the hope for immortality, just in general, and in the abstract, everybody, most people would like to live forever, but in very manifest ways, in very specific ways, connected to our lives and our experience in the earth. Now, this earth is our home. That's biblical. Yeah. And we live here, and if you ask anybody, they're going to say, well, what do you love about being alive? And they're going to say all these sorts of things. I love the mountains, I love travel, and I love the earth. That's in all of us. And so conditionalism really highlights the correct biblical vision of the future for our home, but an even better version. So everything that is good about the way the world is now, we're very aware of how it's gone wrong, but all that, plus all this glory, all this goodness, all this flourishing and it's exciting civilization, meeting God face to face, it's a context for being immortal that I think really resonates with human longings. And so I'm excited by not only fellow believers changing their minds and being caught up in that biblical vision, because it's holistic, it transforms us, right? It's not abstract, it's not just, here's my theology. That really connects with everyday life, and that motivates our living. And I'm really excited to see that flow on to evangelism and apologetics, because I actually think that could lead to something of a revival. If you look at Christendom and how that's shifted in the West, there's no reason it can't shift back in the other direction. And perhaps some of these misunderstandings, as they flow on to the gospel message that we've been giving people for, say, 100 years or so, it just doesn't appeal to people, right? Well, how would you like, can you be certain where you're going when you die? Well, what do I do with that if I'm not a believer? But I know what to do with it if the message is slightly clarified and it connects with what I already hope for, what I already understand deep down about this place, what I've done wrong, so that there's a real translation of this doctrine into simple language that I think could be quite the catalyst.
I just really enjoyed listening to you. I took notes because there was so much there. I may not look at them again, but it kept me immersed. I know every word and verse and write it down. Thank you very much. I'd quite like to share some of this with doctors and med students. I have a bit to do with them. And but I feel like if I tried to explain what you've given us today, I'd get all mixed up.
Yes.
And obviously, over time, you're looking at the Bible and you're getting new concepts as God shows it to you as you study the Bible. But can you tell me, if I wanted to rethink through what you have shared and go broader than that, of all those sort of books you listed and there's your website, where would be the best place to go? And I've already read Tom Wright's.
There you go.
So apart from Tom Wright, where would you say we should go? And knowing that we've all probably got our own secular jobs and we're
Yes,
busy.
for sure. Yes.
So where do we go to try and get a sum up of this?
That's a great
really
question.
Understand
Very
this?
practical question too. The general area that you're looking for, if you're doing your own research, you want to get more into biblical theology. And if you just go in that direction, you will hear people talking more about the context and these sorts of changes. I would highly recommend Middleton's book. I'll just get that back up. Called A New Heavens and a New Earth. This is a must read. Everybody's read it, recommends it. That's the blue one. J. Richard Middleton is the author. And he only covers sort of the annihilation option on a few pages, but the rest of his book is the logic that leads up to that. And the subtitle is Reclaiming Biblical Eschatology. Certainly you can go to our website, rethinkinghell.com. I've drawn upon a paper that I wrote for this book. You'll get a kick out of the title. I presented this, so I was very new to conditionalism at our first conference, and presented an early version of this paper. It's called Tempest Theophany, Cosmic Conflagration.
I can't write that fast enough.
Don't bother. And the Vanished Vanquished. That's only the first half. Toward a Trinitarian framework for immortality and annihilation. So I was thinking and exploring a broader framework, a little bit of what I've tried to capture tonight, or today, that I thought would be a good context out of which questions about annihilation and conditional immortality really emerge very naturally. And this is sort of, Edward Fudge's book was a straight down the line exegetical study. And if you're sort of tuning into some of the connections, you can get a little bit of this out of it, but we're still waiting on a similar theological defense of conditionalism. And God willing, Rethinking Hell is aiming to publish something like that. But at our first conference, the keynote speaker, John Stackhouse, said, here are the reasons why Edward's book, despite its strengths, hasn't won the day. And he went on to talk about how change happens in the theological world. And he talked about the need for a more theological exploration. And some of those things, his advice was very practical. But it's starting to look like other people, non-conditionalists, are actually doing that work. So yeah, that book there is highly recommended. Feel free to get in touch with us. My email address is my name, Peter Grice, at our website, rethinkinghell.com. Be more than happy to chat to you some more. We got the time.
We got half
Yeah.
an hour.
We've got the hour and a half now, so we
Okay.
probably need to wind up.
Like to finish now?
Yeah, I think that's
Okay.
it. Right, Gary, do you want to?
Yeah, unless anyone has one burning question. No, that sounds good then. Thank you very much, Peter, for your presentation today and stimulating thinking in these areas.